Hey everyone, and welcome. Have you ever looked at the stock market or maybe the price of a house in your neighborhood and just thought, how on earth does that make sense? One day prices are soaring to the moon, and the next they seem to be in a free fall. Well, today we're going to dig into the real reason why that happens, and I think you'll find the answer is not at all what you'd expect. Okay, let's get into it. So, this is the big question, right? It hits so close to home for all of us our savings, our retirement, whether or not we can even afford a house. We're usually told a pretty simple story to explain it all. But in this explainer, we're going to pull back the curtain and show you a much more powerful and way more important force that's really pulling the strings. You can really think of this as a tale of two stories. The first one is the simple story, the one you've probably heard 1,000 times. It's all just supply and demand. But the second story, the real story, is all about the deep inner workings of our financial system. Everything from the big banks down the street to the massive policy decisions made by central banks. And trust me, understanding that second story is the key to everything. So, to get started, let's anchor ourselves with something we can all wrap our heads around the housing market. It's really the perfect place to start untangling this whole price puzzle. The simple story for housing usually goes something like this. Prices keep going up because we're just not building enough new houses for everybody who wants one. You hear about land shortages or building regulations getting in the way. It sounds logical. Too many people chasing too few houses. And look, that's not totally wrong, but it's not even close to being the whole picture. So, what are we missing from that simple supply and demand story? Well, it turns out there's this massive engine driving prices that often gets ignored. See, it's not just about how many people need a roof over their heads, it's about how much money is available to buy those roofs. And that brings us to this really crucial idea financialization. It's a fancy word, but the concept is pretty straightforward. It's what happens when the demand for something, like a house, isn't really about shelter anymore. Instead, it's driven almost entirely by the amount of credit that banks are willing to pump into the market. Because think about it, most of us need a mortgage to buy a home. So the real limit on demand isn't the number of people, it's the supply of debt. And just how powerful is this financial engine? Well, get this. In the UK, in the 10 years leading up to the 2008 financial crisis, bank lending just for the housing sector went up by a jaw-dropping 400%. It wasn't because the population quadrupled, it was because the trickle of credit turned into an absolute tidal wave. And this quote from economy.co.uk just hits the nail on the head. As long as banks are willing to lend more and more, demand just keeps on climbing, pushing prices higher and higher. The ceiling isn't a physical one, it's a financial one. So that leads to the next question. Who's setting the rules for these banks? And that question takes us up another level. We go from the commercial banks that give us mortgages to the institutions that are pulling the giant levers of the entire financial system. We're talking about central banks. You can think of central banks, like the Federal Reserve here in the US, as the conductors of the entire economic orchestra. They've got these incredibly powerful tools, the most famous one, of course, being interest rates, that they use to either speed up or slow down the whole economy. And their decisions create ripples that are felt in every single bank and every market, which, as you can imagine, leads to a massive debate. And that debate is this. When a central bank sees what looks like a bubble forming, whether it's in stocks or in housing, what exactly are they supposed to do about it? This is genuinely one of the most high-stakes arguments in all of modern economics. So on one side, you've got a group that wants to lean against the wind. Their argument is that central banks have to be proactive. If they see a bubble starting to inflate, they should raise interest rates, make borrowing more expensive, and try to gently let the air out before it gets out of control. But on the other side, you have the cleaning afterward camp. They say, whoa, hold on. Don't risk slowing down the entire economy just to pop one little bubble. Let it go, and if it bursts, we can use our policy tools to clean up the mess later. For years, this has been a back-and-forth argument between economists. But what does the data actually show? Well, recent research has dug into this, and it's uncovered a really fascinating and frankly kind of worrying truth. Now, at first glance, this chart probably just looks like a confusing mess of lines. And, well, that's exactly the point. When researchers first started, they just lumped all the data together, and the effect of monetary policy on bubbles looked super inconsistent and unclear. This muddled picture is precisely why the debate went on for so long. But this is where it gets really interesting. What if we're looking at it all wrong? What happens if you stop treating all policy actions the same, and instead you separate the times they tightened policy from the times they loosened it? And here is the first bombshell discovery. It turns out that raising interest rates, the main strategy for the leaning against the wind folks, it doesn't really work to deflate bubbles. The data shows it has no significant effect. It's basically like trying to stop a freight train with a pillow. And then you have the other side of that coin. While hiking rates doesn't seem to pop bubbles, lowering them absolutely helps to pump them up, especially when it comes to the stock market. So the key takeaway here is that the effect is asymmetric. It's a one-way street. And this chart illustrates that one-way street perfectly. First, just look at the top part here. That's the effect of a restrictive policy, like a rate hike. You see how that line just kind of wiggles around zero? That means it's having no real impact. Okay, now look at the bottom part. That's an expansionary policy, like a rate cut. And you can see that clear, undeniable upward push on the stock market bubble. The policy lever works in one direction, but it's basically useless in the other. Okay, so we know that cutting rates can help inflate bubbles, but ever since the 2008 crisis, central banks have been using all kinds of other tools, like quantitative easing, or QE, which is basically creating new money to buy financial assets. So the next question is, does the specific tool they use to expand policy actually make a difference? And the answer is yes, it matters a ton. Look here on the left. You can see how those interest rate cuts before 2008 were clearly fueling stock market bubbles. But now look at the chart on the right. This shows the effect of unconventional policies like QE after 2008. And that bubble inflating effect? It's just gone. In fact, if you look really close, the line even dips a bit sometimes, which suggests these policies might have even had a slight cooling effect. This is huge. It tells us that the way you inject money into the system is incredibly important. So, after all that, where does this leave us? Well, it paints a picture of a really, really tricky and maybe even an unsolved problem for the people who are supposed to be keeping our economy on the rails. So let's just do a quick recap of the big takeaways here. First, and most important, monetary policy's effect on bubbles is a one-way street. It's way easier to pump them up than to bring them down. Second, that means raising interest rates just isn't the silver bullet some people thought it was for popping bubbles. Third, the old tool of cutting interest rates can definitely pour fuel on the fire. And finally, the new tools, like QE, don't seem to have that same dangerous side effect, which is a really critical insight for policymakers today. And all of this brings us to one final, really big question. If the main tool we thought we had to fight asset bubbles is basically useless, it kind of suggests that monetary policy might just be the wrong tool for the job. It leaves you wondering, what new strategies or different kinds of policies do we even have left to try and prevent the next massive financial crisis from happening? What do you think?